This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
With books like Representing and Hip Hop Matters, University of Texas at Austin professor S. Craig Watkins has long been at the cutting edge of scholarship on youth culture, hip hop, and race. Now he joins us today on Left of Black discussing his new passion, social media. S. Craig Watkins joins us this afternoon to talk about his most recent book, The Young and the Digital. This is Left of Black, and I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Good afternoon, you're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we're here this afternoon with University of Texas at Austin professor S. Craig Watkins, author of the recent The Young and the Digital, What the Migration to Social Network Sites, Games, and Anytime, Anywhere Media Means for Our Future. How are you doing this afternoon, Craig?
I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing well. You know, in some ways, I can't imagine even doing a show like this without having you on at some point. You know, you have very much emerged over the last couple of years as kind of our guru around issues of social media, and particularly young folks and black folks. Talk a little bit about how you got to this project. You know, we've known each other for a while in the early days of your work around youth culture and hip hop culture. Great books like Representing on Black Cinema and also Hip Hop Matters from 2005. Talk about your own interest in social media and gaming, you know, over these last couple of years.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to do so. So you're right. I mean, you and I go kind of way back, and you know, I see you both as an inspiration, a colleague, and a friend. And you know, I think our work, you know, for the most part, has sort of centered on issues related to race and culture and media. Social justice, issues of inequality, and certainly in my own work, young people have kind of been at the center of the work done. Primarily coming from my own background and training as a sociologist, I've always been sort of interested in how issues of race and inequality intersect in that space of media and popular culture. So, for the initial set of projects that I started working on early in my career, a lot of it was Black youth focused, a lot of it was race focused, popular culture focused, media focused, but always kind of around how media intersected with the quality of young people's lives and African American youth's lives in particular. But as you know, as our work has evolved, looking at hip hop it takes you into so many different places. Yeah. Places that you don't necessarily always kind of anticipate or expect moving into. And so for me, the study of hip hop has really been about the study of youth culture in general, not just African American youth, not just Latino youth, but young people around this country and increasingly young people around the world. And, insofar as I've been looking at and thinking critically about young people and popular culture and media culture, that has sort of pushed me quite extensively over into the social and digital media space. Oftentimes joke that, hip hop was social, hip hop was mobile before social and mobile media became if it was the boombox or kids getting together, in the courtyard and in the parks and just creating space,
social networking,
social networking, creating with technology. Back in the day, it was a turntable and maybe the spray paint and doing graffiti art. But this notion, right, that youth have always been creative. They've always been technology savvy. They've always been interested in turning their sort of creative expressions into art, into politics, into social commentary, and that's all of what's really happening in the social and digital media space. I mean, so much of what we've looked at over the years in hip hop, those are the same kinds of sensibilities, the same kinds of instincts, the same kinds of practices that are now making social and mobile media such hot topics today here in this country and certainly around the world.
One of the terms that we've heard the last few years to talk about this kind of moment with social media is the idea of folks who are digital natives or digital immigrants. And your work is very much focused on, the generation of folks who the only thing they really know is digital culture and social media. And I wonder for you as the researcher, what was it like? I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the young and the digital in terms of the kind of research that went into it. I know you did exhaustive surveys and interviews with young folks, not just speculating about how they're using the technology, but really having them share with you at length, their relationship to this new technology.
No, absolutely. You're right. I guess, part of it, sort of, connects to some of what I was saying earlier, just in terms of how my work has gravitated toward this space as I've watched and observed and studied and engaged young people, and just kind of following their trends, following their behaviors, and this is kind of where you end up today. But also, and you know this as well as I do, just watching young people over the years, interacting with them in the college classroom, interacting with them in the community, wherever that may be, and you just really begin to pick up on generational shifts and generational changes. And so I just was increasingly sort of intrigued by that. You and I've had these conversations in the past several times with being a parent, and watching and sort of raising young children has certainly, kind of expanded our view of the world. And what's clear, right, is that they live in a time, they live in a culture, they live in a space, that is unique and that is distinct in some ways. And so I just became increasingly just sort of curious about that. So what I wanted to do was, in terms of my research, was basically to sort of enlist young people to help me understand what I was observing, to give me better insight, to give me better kind of information and tools to be able to make sense of the world that was changing as I was seeing it. So, students coming up to me and saying, can I submit my paper, via some type of multimedia platform? Remember one day, many years ago, this is probably about 8 years ago, we were in class talking about Black popular culture, and we were talking about the Dave Chappelle show. And there was one episode that I was trying to recall and use that as an example in class, and I couldn't quite get it out. I couldn't quite recall the episode. The next class day, a student comes to me with the episode on a CD drive and says, I think this is the one that you were looking for. Right. And it sort of suggested to me, right, that they are immersed in a kind of media and cultural world that is so distinct and so interesting, and really sort of transforms how we interact with information, how we process information, as you know, not only how we consume it, but also how we produce it. And I thought that was just a really interesting example of a digital native, of someone, sitting in class, he had the episode on his laptop that I was trying to recall. And so he was engaged with it in a way that I wasn't, and in a way that I thought was just really provocative and really interesting. But in my own work, what I've done over the years is, I like to call it kind of immersing myself in the digital trenches. That's just kind of getting in the spaces and in the places where young people are, where they're hanging out online. And we've done that through survey data, collected, thousands of surveys at this point, a lot of interviews with young people, with teachers, with parents, with community leaders, and also just going into the spaces. If it was MySpace back in the day, if it's Facebook today, if it's Twitter today, and just really trying to learn, about what young people are doing online, the destinations that they're drawn to online, how they're behaving, using those spaces, performing in those spaces, constructing identity in those spaces. And so it's really been about a full kind of immersion in young people's digital world, methodologically speaking, to try to understand what they're doing from a kind of research perspective.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with University of Texas at Austin Professor S. Craig Watkins, author of the recent book, The Young and the Digital, What the Migration to Social Media Sites, Games, and Anytime, Anywhere Media Means for Our Future. We both have young daughters, and of course we both live in the classroom, if we will, and we've heard all the critiques from, let me not say our older colleagues, but let me just say our more traditional colleagues, about multitasking in the classroom. And it's ironic because 5 years ago I would have been one of those folks that would have been very big on making sure anything that beeped and made noise was shut down in the classroom. Right. But I also have come to realize that just in my own work in my life that I actually feel much more, what's the word I want, almost vital and alive and productive when I'm multitasking. Yeah. And so we now have children. My oldest is 12 years old, and it's just natural. And I'm always going back and forth with my wife, is she actually doing any work? Right. And what I've come to realize watching her and also watching students in the classroom is that, this is just a generation that sees the world through multitasking. Right. They don't think twice about it. And so what was your research able to tell you about, the role of multitasking for this young and digital generation?
Yeah, it's a great question and observation. And for me, it's sort of it's a complex phenomenon. I think you're quite right. Multitasking is simply just the way young people do business, just the way that they live. And that was one of the things that for me was sort of fundamental in terms of understanding is that what those of us who didn't grow up in this world, what we see, right, is sort of unique, what we see is sort of distinct, what we see is extraordinary, what we see is problematic, for young people just is, I mean, mobile just is. Computers always being on, always being connected, it's just kind of a fact of life and how they live their lives. And so they don't make a distinction in the kinds of ways that some of us do. And that even includes multitasking. And I have to admit, multitasking again is kind of a complex phenomenon in terms of, how do we begin to make sense of it? How does it impact?
It almost reminds me when we think about athletes being in a zone.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some sort of piece of phenomenon around that strikes me about this whole process of digital multitasking.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think if we understand that for young people that's life. For young people, that's how when they wake up, that's how they see the world. That's to put it more bluntly, that's how they are in the world, right? And so for them, it's just something that they do sort of instinctively, something that they do naturally, and they don't see it right as an intrusion. They don't see having Facebook open while they're also doing something else, having their mobile device next to them while they're doing something else. They don't see those as distractions. They simply see those as aspects of the modern world that they live in. And so I think we have to become more appreciative of that. But we also have to, particularly I think for even younger people, right, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, we also have to help them to sort of begin to navigate that world in ways that empower them as opposed to disempowering them, in ways that enable them to be able to articulate a project, articulate a task without becoming distracted, without becoming disoriented. And so it is a challenge, right? The challenge is always being on, always being connected, even as it is a part of the way in which they do business, a part of the way in which they live in the world. Also getting them to sort of think about, what are some of I think there are consequences potentially too, that we have to recognize and sort of be mindful of as well. And the classroom, I think, is a perfect example of how do you multitask in the classroom, what's appropriate multitasking, what's not appropriate multitasking, insofar as the instructional moment and what's trying to take place in that classroom is concerned.
Right.
I feel it's a great idea, and I would support it in the classroom. I use laptops occasionally when students have asked me, can they use laptops to, let's say, take notes in my class. I know that some professors do not feel comfortable with that technology in the classroom. However, I do not feel that way. I feel like you have to meet students where they are, and the contemporary student today, they Twitter, they use Facebook, they use all different kinds of methods to interact and talk to one another. And I think we need to be open as educators to also use these same technologies in our classrooms to better share our knowledge with students.
In my class, I do not allow it because the environment is such that I'm teaching effective listening skills and oral skills, and that is a big distraction when it comes to their class participation and oral presentations. So it's not permitted in my class.
I enjoy the fact that students today can rent textbooks and not be charged $150 a book and get $50 back on it. So I'm open to them using their textbooks online. I also believe that there should be interaction so that I have my own Facebook page, and if there's an issue, I will go ahead and write on my wall for that. What I also like about it is that if they are taking notes, then they'll be able to highlight issues that I call red flags that say, be a really good test question, or you might want to look up this in your textbook. And if they have it online, it's right there. As for Twitter, problem with that. As for them being on Facebook during class, I've got a problem with that. And I do not allow any multitasking or any electronic media when it comes time to take tests in the class.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with the University of Texas at Austin, Professor S. Craig Watkins, author of The Young and the Digital. You just mentioned that you're in the digital trenches. What has that meant for you as a researcher in terms of your consumption of digital media. Do you find yourself drawn now to Facebook and Twitter, or were you drawn to MySpace 5 years ago in ways that you hadn't expected?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I joke that sometimes one of the consequences of studying social media, one of the consequences of studying mobile media, is that you probably have a little less time to actually do some of it than you would like, which is kind of ironic, right? I'm too busy studying it to do it.
Do it right, yeah.
And but I do try to overcome that. I picked up Twitter the middle of last year, and slowly beginning to get a bit more involved in that. Really kind of understanding how Twitter has evolved as a platform. Look at how a variety of people use it, including yourself. And it really is. Twitter used to be a big joke, just
Right.
a couple of years ago.
Right.
I remember when it made its big public splash here in Austin at the South by Southwest Interactive Festival a few years ago. And early adopters sort of got it and grabbed it, but most people didn't understand it. Most people didn't get it. And yet you look at what happened just last week over in Egypt, or you look at what's happening in other places around the world, and people are suddenly beginning to get why these tools matter and how these tools can matter in our everyday lives. But certainly, observing, watching, being in the trenches has kind of forced me to kind of up my social media game. Oftentimes joke, I try to spend a lot of time with teenagers in my research and just kind of hanging out and talking with them, if it's interviews, if it's focus groups. And I joke, a few years ago, when I would do this and, we would be with teenagers and they would have their mobile devices out, right? And we always encourage them to be yourself and, no change for us. And I'd look at their mobile devices, right? They with all kinds of smartphones and all kinds of, with different features and functions. And I would oftentimes look at my phone and it paled in comparison. I would sort of slide it out of view so that they wouldn't see it. But it's kind of like, I need to up my game if I'm going to be in the game.
You did a piece about a month ago on the Huffington Post, why low-performing schools need digital media. And it's, it's an important conversation now. Barack Obama's race to the top, education, policy, it's really kind of pushing this idea that young folks should have access to iPads and teachers will have access to that. And there are a lot of debates about this. If the quality of the instruction is not there one way or the other, if the quality of the curriculum is not there one way or the other, it's not going to matter what kind of technology that folks have access to. But talk a little bit about the piece. This is something that you've talked about. My colleague here at Duke, your colleague in digital media research, Kathy Davidson, has talked a great deal about this. What ways do you really think social media can really enhance the classroom space, particularly for underperforming schools and underperforming students?
Yeah, no, this is kind of increasingly kind of emerging as a sort of central area of interest and research for me. A lot of the work that I've been doing in terms of the digital media space has been in concert with this large sort of digital media and learning initiative launched by the MacArthur Foundation. And, been sort of steadily involved with that and about to start a new project with them, with a few other people around the country. And one of the things that we're really interested in learning more about is how is digital media changing how young people learn, right? Yeah. So we kind of get how digital media is changing how young people hang out with each other. We kind of get how digital and social media are changing how young people construct and perform their identities, in online spaces. If it was MySpace a few years ago, Facebook today, even Twitter, YouTube, you name it. But at its core, there is this sort of growing sort of interest and intrigue around how young people are creating new kinds of learning spaces, opportunities, and ecologies. In other words, if you think about what young people are doing with social media, it's really quite fascinating, Mark. Young people learn how to do all of this stuff with social, digital, and mobile outside of the classroom. They didn't learn from teachers. They didn't learn from parents. They learned from each other. They learned from peers. They learned from friends. They learned from older siblings, in some cases younger siblings. They're teaching each other how to do all of this amazing stuff that they're doing online in terms of creating and sharing and distributing content and constructing their own sort of digital kind of social space. And one of the things that schools are beginning to understand is not to connect to that, right? Not to leverage young people's energy and enthusiasm and power in terms of social and digital media is really sort of at our own peril. I wrote this piece for the HuffPost because it sort of reflects some of the work that we're about to start doing. But as we look at what's happening, particularly in public schools, and more specifically in terms of urban schools, and even more finally with African American students and Latino students, we see this huge achievement gap in terms of Black students and their white counterparts. If it's math scores, if it's reading, if it's writing, it is a gap that is stubborn, right, and sort of persists. And one of the things that I'm interested in learning more and more about is how can young people's social and digital media lives, if we understand them adequately enough, how can those things be brought into the classroom in ways that just sort of reimagine and reconstruct what the learning and formal classroom might look like? So in other words, I mean, and again, you know this as well as I do. I mean, when you look at the research, when you look at kids in low-performing schools and urban schools, their relationship to schools, their relationship to teachers, to educators, unfortunately, right, is a very poor one, sometimes a very hostile relationship. I have a sister and friends who teach in urban school districts in Dallas, here in Austin, in Houston, in Los Angeles, around the country. And the stories that you hear, right, about what's happening in public schools and in urban schools in particular is really sad. And one of the things that I sort of raised in a health post is, what if we sort of rethought what those learning spaces could look like? What if we sort of rethought what a classroom could look like, what a student could look like, learning could look like, by bringing in some of the social and mobile media technologies that get kids so excited? And I've seen it in my own work, right? How kids respond to mobile devices, if it's the iPod, if it's the iPhone, if it's the iPad, if it's a laptop, if it's some type of device that they feel that they have some control and autonomy over, it really creates, I think, a whole different sort of disposition towards learning. A whole different disposition towards information and content. And schools, I think, for many years, right, have sort of rejected the idea that social and mobile media could be a very positive force in the classroom. But I think many are beginning to rethink that idea. Hopefully through the work that we'll be doing with the MacArthur Foundation, we'll be able to provide some evidence that suggests that, hey, kids really are learning with these tools. Kids really are creating content, they're building competencies, they're building skills that are very important for the 21st century. And why can't our schools be spaces where they continue to do that? Why can't our schools be places that encourage that, be spaces and places where kids actually begin to develop and refine those skills, even in ways that they're doing beyond the classroom currently today?
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor S. Craig Watkins from the University of Texas at Austin, author of the recent book, The Young and the Digital. The Young and the Digital is also the title of a great website that you have. And I want to go back to, some months ago over the summer, and you talked about the impact of Twitter, for instance, and professional athletes, and specifically around the LeBron James moment, and Chris Bosh kind of tweeting on a day-to-day basis, what his reality was, and how folks, the owners and other kind of sports pundits, don't quite know what to do with professional athletes. I mean, I know Nolan Smith, last season had some issues, with his use of his Twitter account here at Duke. But, as you mentioned, how young folks are reimagining themselves in the world through social media. It's interesting that professional athletes are doing the same thing. That great quote that you get from Chris Bosh about how, when he is controlling his own media, right, it's viewed as a distraction, right? Yeah. But when the ESPNs and all these other folks in the world are focusing on him, he's just kind of supposed to play along and go with the game. Right.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things about social media is just how active African American and Latino youth are, and I think you see that, right, in terms of the sports world. I mean, really, in terms of the cutting edge, right? Who's really been sort of engaged with, let's say, Twitter, who's been using Twitter in terms of the world of sports, collegiate sports and professional sports, has primarily been African American athletes.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing, right, is that just a year or so ago, teams were trying to curtail what their athletes were doing or saying via these platforms. In some cases, for example, Chad Ochocinco in Cincinnati during training camp, right, just cutting them off, right, saying, stop live streaming, stop tweeting, stop, whatever you're doing, just stop it, right, because we need your full attention. We need you sort of, here, this kind of, we're in the trenches, we're kind of battling. We don't need those kind of distractions.
Right. Yet if you're HBO, you can follow the Jets around, for a whole preseason, and that's just good marketing for the league. Right?
Exactly. But but it's interesting now, right? And in less than a year or so, or within the last year or so, you see now owners, you see general managers now. It's become much more common. But in terms of early adoption, in terms of really setting the path, right? It was Black athletes who were sort of trailblazing the use of social media in the world of sports, and now it's increasingly becoming common. I'm sort of fascinated with the ways in which young athletes are using social media. I think they're using it in a variety of ways, in complex ways. Some are using it right as a kind of self-promotional tool, and I have no problems with that. I get that. Some are using it right as a way to connect with fans, as a way of sort of breaking down that wall between these sort of multi-million-dollar athletes and the kind of everyday, average, sort of middle-class people who kind of follow them. And I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic in and of itself. Some are using Twitter and social media almost as kind of like their own kind of personal reality-based TV show. And some are using it, right, to sort of promote, the kinds of social causes and issues and sort of civic engagement.
That ESPN's not going to cover, right?
Absolutely. And I'm a fundamental believer, right, that in the age of ESPN, in the age of the 24-hour sort of news cycle, that athletes need to take greater control over their image. Yeah. They need to take greater control over their brand. And I think social media is sort of the perfect outlet, the perfect tool for them to be able to do that. And it's been interesting to see young Black athletes sort of leading the way in terms of charting that path.
Yeah, I think it's been so interesting watching 50 Cent, and say what you will about the content of his tweet, he clearly has understood, and I imagine it's a product of him and also the people around him, clearly has understood the value of using social media to build and maintain a brand. Yeah. And in some ways, it's just been brilliant, the way that he's utilized social media in that regard.
Yeah, and if you just look at the music world, right? Again, it's been hip hop artists, it's been R&B artists, it's been Black artists who really kind of were some of the pioneers, right? Who were some of the early adopters in terms of saying, hey, this is a viable space, this is a viable medium, a viable technology, a way, right, to do all of those things that we just talked about: branding, self-promotion, connecting with fans, doing things that today's record companies aren't doing, right? Which is promoting their artists in the traditional ways that they used to. And now what a lot of artists are saying is that, we can do this on our own via social media, we can do it more efficiently, we can do it more effectively, we can do it more powerfully. And so it's been really interesting to watch just how active hip hop has been in the realm of Twitter, in the realm of technology. But again, you know this just from your own work over the years, that we shouldn't necessarily be surprised by that, right? That it sort of harkens back to what I was suggesting earlier, is that hip hop in some ways has always been about investment in technology. It's always been about ways of sort of creating new spaces and new opportunities.
Street teams 20 years ago, right? Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah.
And you're certainly seeing that now being sort of recreated in the digital media space. And I think it's particularly important now, given the kinds of economic realities that face artists, that face the music industry. So how do you survive? How do you play the game in a digital media world? And given that downloads and digital media and iTunes and things of this nature have really kind of undercut the financial pillars of the industry, you see artists, and particularly hip-hop artists, particularly artists on the margins, are just trying to come up through the game, use social media in some very creative and interesting ways.
You've been watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we were joined this afternoon by Professor S. Craig Watkins at the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, the Department of Sociology, and the Center for African and African American Studies. Actually, the new department in African and African American Studies at the University of Texas. A quick shout out to Ted Gordon. Craig is the author of most recently The Young in the Digital: What the Migration to Social Network Sites, Games, and Anytime, Anywhere Media Means for Our Future. He's also the author of some time ago of the classic book, Representing Hip Hop Culture and Representation of Black Cinema, 1998, University of Chicago Press, and also Hip Hop Matters, which was published by Beacon Press in 2005. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Craig.
Mark, thank you. As always, it's always good to be with you, brother.
Good talking to you also.
All right.
produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.